Welcome, everyone. We're going to wait just a minute. I see some participants are still joining, so just give us a minute here and we'll get started. Thanks for joining. Looks like we still have some more joining, so we'll give it another 30 seconds. Okay, it looks like it is slowed down. Welcome everyone. A couple of quick housekeeping items. First, we'll have some time for questions at the end, so please drop any questions you have into the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to answer those. Second, this session is being recorded. You'll receive the recording after the event. And finally, we hope from this session you come away more prepared and inspired to lead change at your organization. So, with that, why don't I start with some introductions? I will start first with me. I am Katie Rooney. I am the CFO of Maven Clinic. I'm also our interim CHRO. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about both the financial and personal side of healthcare and really what actually drives outcomes, what drives cost, and how those two things convene. Increasingly, the thinking has put a spotlight on the real disconnect between what employers are spending and what they're getting back when it comes to health benefits. And that disconnect is tied to something deeper, the trade-offs employers keep being told they have to make: lower costs or better care, technology or human expertise, broad coverage or deep clinical support, and finally, global scale or local relevance. So, the premise of today's conversation is that those trade-offs aren't a necessary feature of women's and family health benefits. They're signals of outdated or incomplete vendor models, not inherent constraints in what benefits can deliver. I'm joined today by two people who bring very different vantage points on this challenge. The first, Rachel Winokur, is the co-founder and CEO of Taylor Care and a board member here at Maven Clinic. Rachel, welcome. We're so glad to have you. Do you want to spend a
Oh,
minute on your background?
sure. Thanks so much for inviting me. I've had the pleasure of being on the board of Maven for the past several years. I also, as Katie mentioned, am the co-founder and CEO of a company called Taylor Care. We provide end-to-end care navigation and personalized MSK solutions in a full risk model to insurance companies, to employers, and to providers. Previous that I've spent a lot of time both as an investor and as an operator selling in within the healthcare space and building companies within the healthcare space to employers, payers, and providers. I'm really pleased to be here and I'm excited to talk about one of my favorite things, which is women's health.
Thanks, Rachel. And Lindsay, great to have you here as well. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Katie. Thanks so much for having me today. As Katie mentioned, my name is Lindsay Bower. I'm a senior health and benefits consultant with Mercer. I'm actually part of Mercer's health management and well-being practice. So I actually spend most of my time leading Mercer's reproductive health benefits work across the US. So what that means is I work daily with clients of all shapes and sizes as they explore and develop benefits and strategies really particular to the reproductive health space. So, really excited about the conversation we're going to have today.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. And for those of you who may be newer to Maven, a quick word about who we are and why we're leading this conversation. Maven is the world's largest virtual clinic for women and families. We partner with employers and health plans to deliver end-to-end clinical care, education, and navigation across fertility, maternity, parenting, menopause, and more. Today, more than 2,000 employers trust Maven to help improve outcomes, manage cost, and provide equitable access to care across their workforce. And because we sit at the intersection of clinical care, employee experience, and benefit strategy, we have a unique view into how these programs are working in practice and where the gaps remain. Along with the great leaders we have with us here today, I'm excited to have a conversation about some of these trade-offs benefits leaders face when choosing solutions and how to navigate them, and even push on whether you really need to make the trade-offs you've been told you have to make. Now, to start off the conversation, we'd love to get a pulse from all of you on the challenges you're facing. So I will ask us to start the poll on what trade-off do you find the hardest to navigate in your women's and family health benefits strategy? I'll give everyone a minute to get their thoughts in. And if it's not one of these three, feel free to share in the chat. Great. Why don't we close the poll and see where we landed? Interesting. So the majority said low cost and great care. Not surprising. I think so many of us are really facing that challenge right now of rising costs, while also trying to deliver a great service and experience and outcome for our people. So let's get into it. Um, Maybe I'll start with why is this market so hard to navigate? You guys are all here because you know it's complicated, but we really want to try to understand why. And so, Lindsay, I'm going to start with you. You sit across from this every day as you advise employers. What are you seeing from the consulting side that explains how we ended up here?
Sure. So, the market for reproductive health benefits and women's health benefits has really evolved drastically, even just in the last, 5 years. What was once a fairly small space, kind of focused only on fertility, has evolved to include a number of different players, offerings, different types of approaches, and even kind of that expansion across fertility, pregnancy, parenting, menopause, sometimes even more. And that expansion has really been driven by clinical need. So the increased awareness for areas of reproductive health, even outside of fertility, like menopause and perinatal mental health. There's been an employee demand for high touch benefits that support kind of all aspects of family building, and really fast paced, I'd say, commercial innovation, right? But the market's also quickly changing, and it's sometimes inconsistent in how outcomes are measured across programs and how these different types of programs are being delivered. So, that's created buyer confusion, hidden risks, and there's variations in how these different offerings address access to quality of care, different financial models, and levels of clinical management and support for members and patients within these types of programs. So, I think with that, we really ended up with a market that's expanded quickly, may look fairly similar on the surface, kind of program to program, but can be pretty difficult to differentiate without further exploration of objectives and key capabilities.
Yeah, well said. And there was a note in the chat too from someone, and also the fragmentation around it, right? That is a
Absolutely.
real challenge as everyone tries to stitch together their benefit strategy. Rachel, from your perspective, does that match what you're seeing across the digital health landscape?
I mean, unfortunately, it does. I think the access to capital over the past several years has enabled many companies to start, identify problems, many cases the same problems, and build businesses to address those problems. But not all businesses are created equal. And I think the difficulty for many buyers is to understand whether something just looks promising or credible or actually is promising and credible. I do think durability is really important. Certainly, as I know companies are always hesitant to partner with a vendor without the certainty that they will be around for several years. That is really important. And the number one reason for companies to perform is the ability to generate and deliver both clinical benefits as well as financial benefits. And I think that accountability and that delivery of performance is what buyers need to understand and assess before they make buying decisions, and which is absent in many of the crowded space and these companies that Lindsay described are in the women's health space right now.
Yeah, it's such a great point. And I think one of the other things I hear at Maven is that sometimes it's tough to know exactly at that point. How do you evaluate benefits? What are the questions we should be asking? Because vendors use a lot of the same language. How do you really get to the bottom of what that quality of care looks like and develop a framework around that? And so thank you both. I think that's a great setup then to get into a couple of insights we think will hopefully separate some of the outcomes driven models from coverage only benefits and what that looks like. So let's dive in. The first area we want to explore is a trade-off we hear honestly most often, and it came through in the poll. We can either control costs or offer high quality care, not both. And that assumption comes from evaluating benefits really on program cost alone, right? You're not looking at the full ecosystem of cost on the front and the back. And so here's where a lot of evaluations go wrong. When you compare vendors on program cost alone, you're often just looking at the cheapest option. But that really ignores the question of what actually matters. How does that cost your organization when a member has a complication? I saw in the chat when I have an older population, right, who's struggling to get pregnant, where I have a premature birth or higher NICU costs as was raised. That's fair. And so, as you take that full picture into account, all of a sudden that initial platform fee really does sound like a rounding error. So I think what we want to try to get at is, how do we think about a vendor really truly managing that care versus just processing payments on the front end? But Lindsay, maybe, as you think about your advising clients on this all the time, as they're evaluating women's and health benefits, how often are they really looking at the total cost of care versus the program cost alone? And how do you get them to shift to really see that end-to-end perspective?
Yeah, yeah. So I think, we've started to see a shift in how employers are thinking about cost for these types of programs, whether that's within kind of what they're doing under a carrier-based model or, evaluation of a program to manage from a fertility or a pregnancy perspective. However, overall affordability, I think we saw that in the chat as well. Like overall affordability continues to be a concern. So, with that as a consideration, how do we begin to look beyond that kind of line item program cost? I think where we're seeing that move is the idea that strong clinical programs can then avoid that downstream high cost event, right? And improve those long-term outcomes. And so taking into consideration, sure, the line item cost of the program, but then also, what are our short-term, but our longer-term total costs as well? And how is that all impacted? So, when we're evaluating reproductive health benefits, we look at kind of that whole picture, program administration and claims costs. But equally important is the value being delivered. And we try and think about this as an overall kind of value delivery model. So what is that value to a particular employer? It could be avoided spend. It could be better stewardship of kind of the overall lifetime fertility benefit, right? That effectiveness or efficiency. It could be, is the pregnancy program actually proactively managing high risk members? Every program that we look at probably has a balance between the cost of the care itself and then what's actually delivered or avoided. So, it's really critical to measure both. So we've started to shift that framing from the traditional, will I get a return on this investment to what is the value on this investment that we're putting into this program? And, that really kind of depends on the objectives of employers. Again, cost always comes into that conversation, but the priorities can also include things like clinical continuity, member experience, overall cost containment. Talent attraction has been a big one over the past couple of years. So how are we building out these overall programs to really deliver on that promise? So tailoring kind of the evaluation to those objectives really helps to get buy-in, I would say, across the organization. One other area that we're seeing a lot of interest in is around high value care. And this is more generally, not just in reproductive health benefits, but kind of across the board in health plan management, making sure members are getting to the right providers at the right time for the right service. That is really important in this area as well, right? So reproductive health programs are no different. Getting to high quality care at the right time for the right need is just as important for good clinical management as in other areas of healthcare. And I think we end up seeing that as part of the overall kind of value proposition in evaluation as well.
It's so well said, Lindsay. And, coming from my lens, even to your point, there are different ways to think about value, but those all still have a return. Right. And its cost is really important, but there are other elements that still lead to greater well-being, which in essence will still lead to a better return on your talent. Rachel, from your lens, right? You talked about you've been an investor looking at this space. You're a founder and CEO in the digital health space. How do you see this across healthcare as a whole and
Yeah.
specifically in this space?
Yeah, so I mean, this is what I live and breathe in my company. So what we do is we take full end-to-end risk. So what's important for us is to be able to not just state that we can deliver on financial and clinical outcomes, but we put all of our money in support of actually achieving those outcomes. Not every company can do that, and I think it's important to understand that there are fundamental tenets that carry through, whether it's a full risk model like what I'm building or something that is actually more akin to fee for service, where you actually do put fees at risk in those models. It's really important to make sure that the business and the partner that you are thinking about working with has an accountability for both a cost delivery targets and performance, but also in clinical performance. And I do not believe that you have to sacrifice one for the other. I've seen companies try to deliver on financial performance by cutting out clinical delivery of services. And that then leads to some of the negative performance and some of the other things that Lindsay was talking about measuring as you think about engagement and you think about employee satisfaction and you think about clinical performance and clinical satisfaction of the clinical network that is important as well. I think that within women's health specifically, historically, it was very much a check the box type of program. Everybody had to offer one. There were many solutions that provided kind of the basic services. And truthfully, there was not a lot of disparity amongst them. And I remember back when I was working for a very large payer, we both had those services and we were building ones to enhance what they were doing. And what we found was that the bar was extraordinarily low for performance. We've come a long way since then. But that being said, I do believe that there really are very few who can deliver on the end-to-end clinical model while continuing to deliver the ROI that employers really need. And obviously, I'm biased because I've been part of Maven for many years, but there is a reason why companies such as Maven exist for many years because of that durability. And that durability, I think, is going to be even more important as the financial pressures get even more significant with the buyers.
Well said. And you're right. I mean, the cost pressures are only increasing. So couldn't agree with you more. And I think it leads a little bit to kind of our second trade-off, which is as you think about then delivering those clinical outcomes and the value, how does technology play into that versus human care? Does it have to be one or the other? And especially as we think about this world of AI we're entering into, both are so important. And employers often think about that as a trade-off, meaning they're going to get less personal support. Or a high-touch clinical model means it's high cost. But I think as you think about evaluating technology in this space, we have to keep in mind everyone has an app, everyone has a portal. That's not the question. The question we need to be asking is how is that technology connected to clinical decision making? Meaning, how is it changing the care a member receives or the information they find to drive a better outcome? Because the reality is technology and clinical expertise should be multipliers of each other and they should work together. So for example, at Maven, we see that predictive risk stratification in maternity identifies complications weeks before traditional care would catch them, right? So that enables us to get ahead of that risk from the data and technology usage we're seeing ahead of time. Or if you take our native fertility cycle tracker, we actually introduced this past year, you pair that with an at-home semen analysis, right? That brings both partners into the fertility discussion earlier and hopefully helps members conceive faster without having to look at advanced treatment. So again, the question shouldn't be, what is the app or what is, what is the portal I'm going to be using? It's how is that technology really improving clinical outcomes? And I think, Rachel, you've said that as you think about Tailor Care, right? As you're looking at a risk-based model, technology obviously plays into that. But maybe you can share a little bit more
Yeah.
on how that's helping you.
Yeah, so we spend a lot of time at our company discussing how to create better clinical outcomes, improved efficiency, but continue to drive the kind of best-in-class clinical delivery models that we offer. I see technology as a real unlock there. And I think about technology much more broadly, as you've described, Katie, than whether it's an app or a portal or whatnot. It is around data. It is around what you can use with that data to drive personalization. And it is around enabling providers to deliver the care that they were trained to do, not to deliver the administrative burden around delivering that care. And it's around enabling employees, patients, members to be able to get the end-to-end experience that they need in the most efficient way possible for what they are looking for. And so as we think about the investments that we are making in technology, and we are not alone, I see this across the board. I think Maven is in sees things very similarly. But I know certainly the other best-in-class companies as well are seeing technology as the ability, as the driver to expand the access to care at a higher care quality level than has previously been done in the past. Automation through AI can be very helpful. I think we are all very careful about how one uses AI and thinking about AI as I said earlier, allowing providers to operate and perform at the top of their license, which is a phrase that many people have talked about in the past, but it's truly, I think, been unlocked with AI. But it really is also around being able to understand and synthesize and all of the information we have about an individual, particularly in an end-to-end, when you have somebody that goes through a care journey, particularly a women's health journey where they're going through and they're starting with, whether it's fertility and preservation to maternity and menopause, that end-to-end data stream is really differentiating because it allows the clinical care navigators and providers to understand what's happened in the past and do it in a very efficient way and allows them to then deliver that care that that patient needs at that time. So I think we're in a new phase that is only going to make our clinical outcomes better, and I think the financial implications, the financial costs of those are going to go down. It's pretty
Yeah, well
exciting.
said. I agree. And Lindsay, I mean, you see this every day, right? As you're helping your clients in their vendor conversations, navigating these technology claims and questions. Maybe help the audience with, what really separates the real clinically driven technology companies you see versus, more of that kind of polished front end.
Yeah, so I think, Rachel said it really well. Being able to kind of pull in those data points end to end and utilizing that technology in a way that's effectively impacting like the overall clinical delivery of care, right? So as we think about what differentiates, true clinical care from like a technology-driven kind of front end, the ability to collect and manage clinical data in a really discrete way so that it can be utilized to both drive care touch points, but also to identify care needs at really impactful times. That also includes certainly the ability to collect data and outcomes from providers and a clinical high performing clinical network. So thinking about not only what's happening on the clinical fertility network, but then also how that's then driving other aspects of reproductive health. So, using that data to effectively identify, manage risk within any of the journeys that are going through these programs. That requires data from a number of different sources. Sometimes that is pulled in from the member themselves, from the clinical interactions they may be having outside of the program, from health information exchanges. The ability to pull all of that together is a really impressive aspect of a technology-driven organization that can also deliver high-quality clinical care. The other piece that I think is really important is the types of specialists that members might have access to within these programs. So not only kind of the data-driven pieces, but then also ensuring that if you have a technology-driven platform, you also have the ability for people to have real-life interactions with clinicians as they're going through their journeys. Certainly, modalities like the ability to kind of text and chat are important for kind of ease of access, but offering that ability to really have a one-on-one clinical interaction, even within a digital health platform, I think is really critical.
Totally agree. And it's interesting. Both of you kind of in your remarks talked about as you think about that journey, right? You said it a number of times, Lindsay, right? The journey of kind of what a member is going through. And Rachel, you said a platform, right? Of kind of how we're connecting someone along that journey. And we also saw it in the chat, right? Kind of how do I think about the fragmentation of the space? And so our third insight is exactly that, which is honestly, fertility outcomes are deeply intertwined with the broader women's healthcare journey. And so for anyone evaluating a standalone benefit versus that integrated platform, you really have to think about what that journey is going to look like for your member. And are you getting the right data and outcomes as they navigate between potentially different solutions? Because that handoff is really critical. If you think about the clinical history of someone, what medications were used, whether there were complications, what does that risk profile look like from fertility into pregnancy? That's really relevant to make sure we're delivering the best care, exactly to the point in the chat to avoid, right, a NICU stay. And so I think that integration is is important. I know as we think about it for Maven, but also obviously is top of mind for many of you. And right now, a lot of those solutions are siloed. You have different vendors, members can fall through the cracks. And so, I think Rachel and Lindsay, maybe just adding on a little bit more to what you've kind of offered. But as you think about the integrated offering and why that's important, maybe Rachel, I'll start with you. Kind of, how do you think about the signal in the clinical model that shows, right, that there is integration and the importance of that, and why that should matter as someone's evaluating their benefits?
Yeah, it's such an important point, Katie, because when I think about what separate vendors mean, that means that you have a separate data repository, you have separate accountability, you have separate care journeys. And that means that for that member who is actually going through full end to end, they are actually going through discrete experiences. It ultimately, I believe, drives a greater dissatisfaction with that employee or that member, but it also creates a real risk to their clinical care because it means that that full end-to-end understanding of what's happening with them, to them, for them is not carried through. And so I think there's a real care clinical downside to it. I also think that when, particularly in the women's health space, as you look about what happens with a fertility uh, program and then understanding that risk profile and that performance drives into and leads into a much more informed and personalized maternity program that really allows you one to shape outcomes before the pregnancy begins, which leads to a much better, not just experience, but much better clinical outcomes for the patient and for their child. Ultimately, I think that, companies that are the most credible are the ones that can really walk through what happens end to end with the members' data, but also at every transition point so that the members and the patients can understand exactly what they're going to experience, but you as the buyer can get real clarity around what is it you're paying for. Disparate systems create fragmentation in a clinical model, but it also creates fragmentation in your economic model. And therefore, there's not necessarily a single point of accountability. And I do think it results in a higher overall cost of care.
Yeah, and we see that, right? We see that in terms of the outcomes. We see that in terms of the cost. But Lindsay, as you think about the clients you're advising, are you seeing more of them start to think about kind of one integrated journey? How, sometimes that's hard too, right? Because that could be having to replace multiple systems, or it could mean higher cost up front to get to the right system. Recognizing obviously there is a benefit down the line. How are you helping your clients think through that?
Yeah, I think as much as I would like to say that there is a very clear line right now drawn between fertility programs and maternity programs, we continue to see a disconnect, right, in the way these programs are operationalized, the way they're delivered. Many employers continue to rely on not even two different vendors, but sometimes just addressing pregnancy support within, their high touch model within a carrier program, while they've, carved out their fertility approach. And I think the challenge really comes in as we think about engagement, right? So engagement is critical to getting the outcomes that you want within these programs. You have to get people to utilize the program in order to get the outcomes you want to see. If you have disparate programs or there's no clear, distinct link or referral pattern between programs, it is really hard to get the level of engagement that's needed to really make a true impact on how the program works. And so that lack of clear handoff and program design can really impact that overall engagement. And I think is really critical to the overall setup.
I think that's right. And it's interesting as you recognize the value of that. I think, another thing we often hear or particularly from employers where they'll push back is because of that relationship model, I can't switch vendors, right? It's not worth the disruption. We'll wait until to our next renewal cycle. But at the same time, that could be even more costly because the members who need your benefit the most are often the ones mid-treatment, mid-pregnancy, mid-journey. And so every month you stay with the wrong vendor, it's another month those members aren't necessarily getting the care they need, and another month of potential claims that could be avoided. So, I do think when you think about the delay to switching providers, it could delay outcomes. So if I think about just kind of our population, more than 80% of the fertility members across our client base actually came from clients who transitioned from another fertility vendor. And that's right, because they came across surprise cost, a poor member experience, clinical gaps. And so I think we just have to continue to keep in mind that the transition itself doesn't have to be disruptive, right? We can transition a client in as few as 4 weeks because you have to have that dedicated transition support for your members, right? We're not forcing anybody to switch providers mid-journey. It's making sure we actually add and supplement the care to get them the right care with their existing providers if that's who's right for them. But I don't know, Lindsay, if you hear something similar, right? When you're talking with employers, what objections they see to making some of those switches.
Yeah, and I think it's really hard sometimes to visualize what that true cost is of changing partners, right?
Yeah.
Whether that's from a carved out model to a carved in model, a carved in to a carved out, or kind of vendor to vendor across the space. And that's the really critical piece of the evaluation. So, fertility, obviously a very complex, sensitive journey. And typically the clients that I work with really want to avoid anything that disrupts that process, right, for a member. However, sometimes a move is necessary, whether that's for cost reasons, service performance reasons, or otherwise. There are scenarios where a move is really necessitated. In addition to kind of that overall cost of care consideration, really understanding the impact potentially on outcomes and performance and member experience is really kind of top of mind when we're seeing a potential transition. So, typically the clients that I'm working with are really kind of really trying to understand what are their members going to experience with a move? How does that look from their perspective? There can be disruptive aspects, right? So from a provider network disruption perspective, maybe from a benefit design perspective, there's certainly different ways in which we see benefits administered in this space. Maybe there's lost access to a current program that they may be going through. But there's also potentially really positive changes, right? So maybe enhancements in the offering, there's efficient benefit structures that they may be able to take advantage of, or maybe they'll get greater clinical support under a different model. Really digging into and understanding all of those specific aspects are kind of the first step. They're not always evident, right, in a cost-based analysis only. But they're really critical to understand when at least considering a move. Even before you kind of get to the point at which you say, it's time to make a switch, that's the first place to start.
And I think those are great questions to be asking because you're right. It's understanding the transition of care, but there's a whole wrapper around that. So that makes a ton of sense. Rachel, same for you, right? What are you seeing in the market? That inertia, kind of how do we help our clients kind of think through that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think inertia is just a fundamental forcing function for a lot, or maybe a lack of function, forcing function for across many spaces. It always feels harder than it really is. And what everything that Lindsay just articulated in terms of the disruption, the care, the costs, are all feel like very tangible items to have to overcome. Um, I think companies that have done this before understand what it takes to transition an employer or a customer from provider to one partner to another. And so therefore all of those workflows are all mapped out, and that transition is actually much easier than I think people fear, right? It's the fear of the unknown. And I do think that, to Lindsay's point, the employee or member or patient experience is so critical. And as you said, Katie, not disrupting care, ensuring that each patient is treated as an individual and accommodations are made to make sure that they are able to see through their care journey is really, really important. Maven has had great success in doing that in the past across the board, which is why, as to your point, 80% of your fertility patients have come, or members have come from other providers or other partners or vendors, I should say. I think what's really important, though, is two things, which is one, the incumbents who are losing the volume can operate in one of two ways. They can operate either as a partner or they can operate in a very difficult way. And I think you learn a lot when you start talking to a partner to understand how this transition is going to go, both from your existing partner and the future partner, you learn a lot. And I think you can learn a lot about why you may need to switch if that incumbent is making it very difficult for you to switch, because that I think is not a positive signal on the long-term partnership and relationship that you have with that vendor. The other thing that I would say is that as with most decisions, it's very rare that one regrets a decision that was made under the circumstances of recognizing that there was a better option out there, that the switching costs end up being in the rearview mirror, and the positive benefits of having a better partner, and in this case, vendor, but are always valued. And one always ends up looking forward, not backwards, particularly if you have a really good transition plan. And I think that's really important because it's hard to have that framework, but always going forward, I think people are very satisfied and happy that they've made a decision to switch out of something that wasn't working for them.
It's such an important point. I'll put my CFO hat on like to that, right? It's sometimes you want to just manage the short term, right? Because it's easier. But if you don't have that long-term view of what's best, you're going to make the wrong decisions in the interim.
And I
It's
think, Katie, I think this is true across the board. We're talking about it with
so
respect to women's health vendors, but I think this is if we can all look at the decisions that we have to make as leaders and as executives, these decisions can be very difficult in the near term, but are very gratifying and appropriate in the long term. It's making sure you can get over that hump. I think this is no different.
yeah, thank you both. And it's interesting. We've been talking about kind of the importance of the continuation of care, that kind of platform and journey perspective. But the other piece, maybe as we go to our final insight, is I was actually with a client last week who was saying, we've just built up our benefits, like some of it through acquisition, globally by region, right? We've never had a consolidated strategy. And because, it's really hard to discern if there really are companies who can help us globally. And I think, we're hearing that more and more, right? We have multinational employers. They want to think about a cohesive strategy across their population. But I think it's important you know the right questions to ask around global capabilities because to some, global can mean an employee in Germany can submit a reimbursement request, but yet they can't reach a clinician in their time zone, right? Or in their language. And that's not necessarily the care you're looking for, right? That's a reimbursement model. So when a vendor says global, I think it's really important to understand what that means. It can't just be a payment card that works internationally or an app that's been translated. You want to have the clinical context locally to make sure your population is getting the care and support they need in their language and in their time zone. And so maybe Lindsay, I'll start with you. How do you help your clients evaluate global capabilities?
Yeah, yeah. So we are certainly seeing clients that have employees outside the US really look for that alignment, right? Between US and global support. It's becoming increasingly important. But I think the key piece there is it can't be a US based solution with a global label, right? So we really need to be building out and addressing culturally relevant solutions, really locally compliant designs, understanding local provider access and how that might work in a particular area. I think that also includes, a good understanding of what are regulatory requirements, what are data privacy rules, how do we think about this from an operational perspective? What are the local mechanics to doing claims or reimbursements, and capabilities in that space? So, certainly local language support, currency handling, those types of things are a little bit of table stakes, but, those are the types of things that need to be addressed as you're starting to evaluate a really broad kind of global strategy, whether you have people in, the US and two other countries, or you have people, spread across the entire world. Sometimes we also see a little bit of a phased approach. So sometimes we see pilots in really like priority countries, and then, utilize that to kind of then jumpstart a broader strategy. But I think that move towards a global approach to these types of benefits is really important.
Yeah, well said. And Rachel, I mean, as I think about both in your role, but also as you're evaluating companies you've invested in, right? Kind of how do you evaluate that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Lindsay pointed out so many of the key questions to really diligence. I think the one piece that I would just add on to Lindsay's comments is also around clinical model differentiation. Different global, I mean, if you think about it, different countries have different clinical systems and models of care, not just in terms of reimbursement, but also in terms of delivery of care. And I think what's really important is to make sure that your partner both understands and is modifying and delivering their program within that specific global environment, that specific, country or national environment. I think, as Lindsay said, it's not a U.S. business, it's not a U.S. program with a different language wrapper around it. It is truly modeled for that geography. And so there, yes, there is certainly the modifications that need to address time zones and need to address payment models, but it is also around other clinical guidelines. Certainly, regulatory, as Lindsay pointed out, is really important. So I think when you evaluate a company that is doing this, a couple things come to mind. One of which is to really get detailed in terms of understanding what those programs look like, get a variability across different countries so you understand exactly where what the resources are, the clinical models look like, as well as data privacy, engagement, et cetera. I would also do a lot of customer references. Understand what other customers are experiencing having launched in those countries, because I think you'll get a real sense of what it looks like, just not just to implement, but also to have from an end-to-end employee experience, which is really important, particularly for global countries, for global companies. You need to have a highly engaged employee workforce that is highly disparate. And so you want to create that seamless experience that they're all benefiting from. So anyway, so I think those are a few things that I'd add, but I think Lindsay otherwise nailed it. It's really important for a company to take a global approach, not a localized approach with a global, quote unquote wrapper.
Wrapper. Yeah, well
Yeah.
said. Well, great. Well, thank you both. Maybe I'll turn us a little bit to then just think about, now that we've looked at what some of the best models look like, how do you think about the right questions to ask? So we actually did some third-party research. We compared multiple vendors in the space to try to get at what are some of the most important questions you should be asking. And I'll walk you through a couple. The first was, what percentage of your fertility members achieve pregnancy without IVF or advanced treatments? And this comes back to the point of clinical outcomes, right? Is the vendor routing people to the right treatment, which could be less invasive and less costly, right? How are they getting paid? Or walk me through your total cost structure, right? Or including any fees that might surprise customers. Vendors can hide costs in treatment markups, claims processing, admin fees. A good signal is when a vendor has really transparency in their pricing structure and they're, want to talk you through that. They disclose any negotiated provider rates. They don't put markups on treatments. These, I think, are kind of important factors for you to ensure you are getting the best model. They should also be thinking about performance guarantees. I mean, to Rachel's point, right? A full at-risk model, if you're not willing to stand behind your clinical outcomes, I think, that likely suggests, you're not confident in the results you can drive. And then finally, what exactly is covered? For whom, across what life stages? Matters because comprehensive can mean, very different things to different vendors. So make sure you're finding an offering that supports partners, their family members. It enables seamless transitions between support for different life stages. Again, we saw that in the chat. You want to make sure someone's really taken care of throughout their journey, both on for the mother and the father and kind of the overall parenting side. From Maven's side of the table, I think the single biggest red flag we see is when vendors can't provide that outcomes data. So, you may be told it's proprietary, every member's journey is different. But I think, as I said, it's just so critical that vendors are confident in their clinical model and will stand behind that. So I just reiterate, I do think that's a really important one. Let me spend 1 minute just on Maven and then we'll get into Q&A. But I do want to just make sure the group is aware, right? At Maven, we are really focused on ensuring the support we deliver makes an impact for our clients and their employees. We know that when employers provide comprehensive, outcomes-driven women's and family health benefits, there's results both for the employer but also for the member. And we're seeing that in our outcomes. You can see here on the slide. We have 27% lower NICU admissions, up to 15% lower C-section rates. which really is a direct reduction in your claim spend. When 30% of fertility members achieve pregnancy without treatment, that's $15,000 to $25,000 in avoided cost per member. And overall, across maternity, we see about $9,600 in savings per birth. So, we are making sure, as we started the call thinking about ROI, there's value to your members and obviously to you in terms of cost, but there's also a clinical outcome, which is really what we're all working towards. All right, Rachel and Lindsay, thank you. It's been so great having you. But I think we have a few minutes left. So I am going to ask you maybe one final question, and then I will open it up to Q&A. So please, if anyone has questions, I know some were submitted ahead of time, which I can go through, but feel free to enter them in the Q&A there at the bottom as well. All right. Rachel, given our conversation today, what do you think is the number one question every employer should be asking before they select a women's and family health vendor?
So I think they should ask them to provide validated clinical outcomes, ideally matched to a population like your population, and make sure it's actually not their own internally generated numbers, but it's either peer reviewed or it's actuarially done. That's really important. The second thing is I would also talk to them about what happens when clinical outcomes fall short of what they project, because I think that will then demonstrate whether they are taking real clinical accountability. Confident companies have clear answers, others deflect. You'll also see that companies that have a long history of being able to perform and deliver can answer questions with demonstrated and historical information that will give and provide more validity and confidence to what they're committing to you. And then the third piece I would say is, so I know you asked for one question every employer should ask, but I feel like there's probably three, is really actually understand how they're putting their economics, how they're tying their economics to their performance. I think that's really important because that will demonstrate, as we've talked about, their confidence in being able to deliver on the clinical outcomes that they are committing to.
Great. Lindsay, how about you?
Yeah, so I think, one of the most important questions you can ask as part of any type of evaluation is, what are you willing to guarantee? What type of clinical outcomes are you willing to guarantee? What type of financial outcomes? What type of operational outcomes? And ensuring that the thresholds for those outcomes are truly competitive. They are not just check the box performance indicators. I think that is really where you both can see what a program can measure, what they are measuring and what they're able to report out on, and then what they really feel confident about.
Love it. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you both so much. I appreciate it. I did see one question come in, which I will get to here shortly. I also saw a note. We will be sharing the recording and the slides. We will send a follow-up note to everyone, so you will definitely have those. But maybe the first question that came through, I'll start, and then maybe Lindsay would be helpful to hear your perspective too. But it was why do you find your clients opting to offer Maven rather than expand their women's and family health benefits through their medical plan? Do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
You can start.
So listen, it's a great question. And often, if you think about the services from a Maven perspective, kind of the dedicated care in a 24/7 model, with kind of a curated provider network, we can guarantee and provide the right treatment and outcomes to an employer and their people throughout their journey. And a lot of the health plans aren't able to offer that. So it's a higher level of care and service. We can also supplement those offerings with the health plan. So there's different models you can look at, but if you think about the journey from fertility to maternity to parenting and pediatrics through to menopause, a lot of those solutions actually aren't even offered today through the health plans. And so, Maven can, one, offer those, but also partner with the health plan if that makes sense as well.
Yeah,
Lindsay,
and
anything you'd add?
I would agree, Katie. I think when we see clients kind of evaluating this market, when they choose to, partner with a vendor in this space, it is often due to the desire to really kind of connect the dots across the member experience in a really high touch way, and in a way that carrier capabilities may not exist in certain areas.
Okay, and then maybe Rachel, I think I'll direct this one to you with your finance hat on. How are the best companies demonstrating the clinical ROI in a way that lands with their CFOs and their finance teams?
Yeah, it's a lot of what I feel like it's a lot of what I've kind of said previously, but packaged together because it's all important in a presentation to get CFOs on board, which is you're committing the clinical outcomes. Those clinical outcomes are really important for buyers, but the CFOs want to make sure that those clinical outcomes lead to financial outcomes and to financial commitments that you are making to them. So you've got to tie them directly together. Part of that is, as I was talking about, third-party validation, really important because you can't manipulate that data. And that demonstrates, particularly for those who like to get into the data, that there is a historical set of proof points, and they are valid. And then the last is that I think, as we've talked about, being able to put your money where your mouth is really important. So structuring contracts that address the CFO's needs, whether it's capping on costs and creating, whether there are PGs or there are, fees that get paid based on specific clinical performance measures. Those are important, and those are important to make sure that they bring together what the CFO is requiring or looking for with what the clinical program needs to deliver. And so I think if you can package them all together, that's going to be very meaningful. And I think we'll also just create a better partnership because you're putting all of the requirements up front, so there are no surprises for the employer.
Yeah, great point. We have two more questions. Before I do that, I do want to flash up a poll just so we can make sure we hear from everyone. Hopefully this was helpful, but please let us know just so we can continue to make sure we're developing content that is best for all of you. So if you get a chance, take that. But the next question I got is, what are some of the menopause solutions Maven offers? So two things I will say. Within kind of the employer landscape around our menopause offering today, think about it as access to clinicians to have the discussion around should you be evaluating HRT, right? How are you managing your menopause symptoms? How do you think about kind of post-pregnancy, to periomenopause to menopause? Like I was actually on the phone with my provider at Maven, who's helping me in perimenopause think about, right, birth control versus HRT and how do you evaluate that? So it's really a comprehensive program to help your members navigate menopause and periomenopause. The second thing is we're also launching a consumer business as well for people who may want to go direct to have that discussion with a provider specific to HRT. So we have multiple solutions based on kind of what is best for the employer and their people. Okay, and then maybe the last question, I'll close the poll, is for Lindsay. When you look across your client base, what are the most forward-thinking employers doing in this space that you think others haven't caught up to?
So it's a good question. I think, you know, outside of that connection point from kind of an end-to-end approach to reproductive health, I think the next kind of evolution in this space is to focus more broadly on women's health, access to primary care, access to behavioral health, understanding the kind of other factors that may impact women's health and overall well-being that they're bringing to work with them potentially. How do we weave all of that into a holistic approach to supporting women in their kind of workplace and in their careers? I think, there are certainly programs that have a space in that, but I think the ability to connect the dots across an ecosystem of programs and policies and culture within an organization, I think that next evolution in women's health is where we're going to start to see strategy being built out.
I love that. And what a way to improve outcomes, to your point, right? If you can do that well. Well, great. Well, thank you both so much. It was such a privilege having you. If anyone on the call has more questions, feel free to follow up. You can go onto our contact page, mavenclinic.com/contact. You can download our latest guide, which shares more insights, leverage the QR code here. But thank you all for your participation, and a huge thanks to Rachel and Lindsay. Hope everyone has a great rest of the day.